The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden light across the small clearing where the group had gathered. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the distant sound of a creek provided a soothing backdrop as they made their final preparations. Ethan, the leader of the group, stood by the trailhead, checking his gear with the meticulousness of a seasoned outdoorsman. His backpack, stuffed with provisions, weighed heavily on his shoulders, but he wore it with ease like an old friend. "Everyone ready?" Ethan called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. Claire, a city dweller with more enthusiasm than experience, adjusted the straps on her new hiking boots and flashed a bright smile. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice tinged with excitement. This was her chance to escape the concrete jungle, to reconnect with nature in a way she hadn't since childhood. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Mark, who had reluctantly agreed to join the hike at his girlfriend Jenna's insistence, grunted in response. He was less thrilled about the prospect of spending a weekend in the woods, far from the comforts of civilization. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, earning a playful nudge from Jenna. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jenna teased, her eyes twinkling with amusement. She was the adventurous type, always looking for the next thrill, and the idea of exploring an unmarked trail was irresistible to her. Lucas, the quietest of the group, stood slightly apart from the others, his eyes scanning the tree line with a focused intensity. He was a mystery to the others, a friend of Ethan's who had joined at the last minute. There was something about the way he carried himself, a certain calmness that belied his true intentions. He hadn't said much during the drive up, but now as they stood on the edge of the forest, his silence spoke volumes. Ethan took one last look at his map, a tattered, hand-drawn sketch he had found online, promising an uncharted adventure, and nodded to himself. The trail wasn't marked on any official maps, but that was part of the appeal. They weren't just hiking, they were explorers, venturing into the unknown. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, leading the group into the forest. The trail started out wide and inviting, a well-trodden path that wound through the trees in a gentle arc. The early morning light filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the forest seemed alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional scampering of small animals. The group fell into a comfortable rhythm, the initial awkwardness of the hike giving way to easy conversation. As they walked, Ethan kept a steady pace at the front, his eyes occasionally flicking to the map, ensuring they were on track. Claire, who had positioned herself near the middle, took in the sights with wide-eyed wonder. She marveled at the towering trees, their bark rough and ancient, and the way the underbrush seemed to hum with life. It was a far cry from the concrete and glass of the city, and she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. Mark, on the other hand, was already beginning to regret his decision. His feet were sore, and the novelty of the hike had worn off quickly. He glanced over at Jenna, who was practically bouncing with energy, and tried to muster a smile. He knew she was excited about the trip, and he didn't want to ruin it for her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail, though beautiful, felt somehow wrong, like it was leading them somewhere they shouldn't go. Lucas, bringing up the rear, walked in silence. His eyes were sharp, scanning the forest with a focus that bordered on obsessive. Every crack of a twig, every shift in the wind, seemed to draw his attention. It was as if he was waiting for something only he could sense. The first hour passed without incident, the group's initial excitement giving way to a more subdued appreciation of their surroundings. They stopped occasionally to take pictures or to examine an interesting plant or rock formation. Ethan pointed out various landmarks, explaining their significance with the authority of someone who had spent years studying the outdoors. It was clear he relished the role of guide, and the others followed his lead without question. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the trail began to change. The once well-defined path started to narrow, the underbrush encroaching from all sides. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The cheerful sounds of birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that settled over the group like a shroud. It was Lucas who first noticed the carving. They had been walking in silence for some time, the oppressive atmosphere dampening their spirits, when he suddenly stopped and pointed to a tree just off the path. The others gathered around, curiosity piqued. Carved into the bark was a strange symbol, an intricate design that seemed almost too deliberate to be random. It was unlike anything they had seen before, part geometric, part organic, with lines that twisted and curled in impossible ways. Ethan frowned as he examined it, his hand tracing the lines with a furrowed brow. "What do you think it means?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "Probably just some hiker with too much time on their hands," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. But as they continued on, more carvings began to appear. Each one was different, yet they all shared the same unsettling complexity. They were too precise, too intentional, to be the work of a bored hiker. The group's unease grew with each step, the trail becoming narrower and more overgrown as the carvings multiplied. By the time they reached the next clearing, the mood had shifted entirely. The light-hearted banter was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Even Jenna, who had been so eager for the adventure, looked uneasy. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the forest itself was aware of their presence and didn't want them there. Ethan checked the map again, his expression unreadable. "We should keep going," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that hadn't been there before. The trail, once so clear, was now little more than a faint line through the underbrush, and the forest seemed to press in on them from all sides. No one argued. They fell into line behind Ethan, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to their adventure. It was a presence, ancient and malevolent, and it was leading them somewhere they did not want to go. As they pressed on, the sunlight continued to fade, the dense canopy above allowing only slivers of light to reach the forest floor. The carvings on the trees became more elaborate, more menacing, their lines sharp and angular, like the teeth of some predatory creature. The air grew thick, the sounds of the forest fading into an oppressive silence. It was Claire who finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should turn back." Ethan stopped and turned to face the group, his expression grim. "It's too late for that," he said quietly. "We're in this now. We have to see it through." And so they continued, deeper into the forest, the trail narrowing to the point where they had to walk single file. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. and the carvings on their trunks watching with cold, unblinking eyes. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step, the forest's grip tightening around them. None of them noticed that the path behind them had vanished, swallowed by the encroaching trees. There was no going back now. The forest had grown darker, and with each step, the once inviting trail became more treacherous. What had started as a well-defined path was now barely more than a faint trace in the underbrush, the trees pressing in so tightly that the group was forced to walk single file. The air, once crisp and clean, now felt heavy, thick with a dampness that clung to their skin. The only sounds were their labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath their feet. Ethan, still leading the way, slowed his pace. The sense of unease that had been simmering under the surface since they first noticed the carvings had now settled into a cold dread. He glanced at the map again, though it had become more of a talisman than a guide, something to cling to in the face of mounting uncertainty. The lines on the map seemed to blur together, the trail they were supposed to be following now almost indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Mark's voice cut through the oppressive silence, strained and edged with frustration. He had been lagging behind, the weight of his unease growing heavier with each step. Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. "It's the only way," he replied, though the confidence in his voice had all but disappeared. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but was cut off by a sudden movement to his right. He spun around, heart pounding, only to find Lucas standing unnervingly close, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Lucas's eyes were wide, his expression unreadable. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Lucas didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and detached, as though he were speaking from a great distance. "The forest is changing," he said. "It doesn't want us to leave." A shiver ran down Mark's spine, and he quickly moved to catch up with Jenna, who was walking just ahead. She gave him a worried glance, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would make sense of the growing sense of wrongness that surrounded them. As they continued, the forest seemed to come alive in ways that defied explanation. The trees, once silent sentinels, now whispered to one another in a language of rustling leaves and creaking branches. The carvings, which had been unnerving but stationary, now appeared to shift in the corners of their vision, their lines twisting into new shapes when no one was looking directly at them. Ethan, determined to maintain some semblance of control, pressed on. But the trail was no longer a trail. It was a corridor of shadows and twisted roots, leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. He tried to pick up the pace, but the terrain became increasingly difficult, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. His breathing grew ragged, not just from exertion, but from the mounting fear that he was losing his way, both literally and figuratively. "Maybe we should stop for a moment," Claire suggested, her voice trembling. She had been trying to maintain her composure, but the oppressive atmosphere was wearing her down. Ethan was about to respond when they emerged into a small clearing, barely large enough for the group to stand together without brushing against the surrounding trees. In the center of the clearing was something that made them all stop in their tracks. A cairn of rocks, crudely stacked, with a familiar carving etched into the largest stone at the top. It was the same symbol they had seen on the trees, but this time it seemed more intricate, more intentional. "What is this?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking as she took a step closer to the cairn. There was a strange energy emanating from it, a subtle vibration that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Lucas was the first to respond, his tone as unsettling as the carvings themselves. "It's a marker," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "A marker for what?" Mark demanded, his frustration boiling over into anger. "Where the hell are we, Lucas? You seem to know more about this place than the rest of us. What's going on?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the cairn, his eyes never leaving the carving. "This isn't just a forest," he finally said. "It's something more ancient. Something that exists outside of time, outside of reality as we know it." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense." "None of this makes sense," Ethan snapped, his patience fraying. "But arguing isn't going to get us out of here. We need to keep moving." But as they turned to leave the clearing, they realized with a sickening lurch that the trail they had entered through was no longer there. In its place was a wall of trees, thick and impassable, their branches twisted together like the bars of a cage. They were trapped. Jenna took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "This can't be happening. We just came from that way. There has to be an opening." She rushed to the edge of the clearing, frantically searching for any sign of the trail. But there was nothing, just trees, endless and unyielding, surrounding them on all sides. Mark joined her, his own panic rising. He pushed against the trees, trying to force his way through, but the branches seemed to tighten around him, pushing back with an unnatural strength. "It's like they're alive," he gasped, stumbling back into the clearing. Ethan's mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but he came up empty. The forest had them in its grip, and there was no way out. He looked to Lucas, who was still standing by the cairn, his expression unreadable. "What do we do now?" Claire's voice was small, trembling with the weight of their collective fear. Lucas finally looked up, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "We're not the first to come here," he said quietly, "and we won't be the last." Before anyone could respond, a low rumble echoed through the forest, like the growl of a distant storm. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the trees around them seemed to sway, their branches creaking ominously. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to seep through the underbrush, curling around their legs like ghostly tendrils. "We need to find another way out," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't stay here." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The forest was changing, reshaping itself around them, cutting off every possible escape. The trail they had followed was gone, swallowed by the very woods that had led them here. With no other choice, the group huddled together, their eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of hope. But there was nothing, just the encroaching fog and the oppressive weight of the forest's gaze. The trail had narrowed, leading them to this place, and now it had disappeared entirely, leaving them stranded in a nightmare of their own making. "We need to split up," Lucas suddenly said, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence. The others stared at him in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" Mark snapped. "We're already lost. Splitting up will just make things worse." But Lucas was insistent. If we stay together, we'll all be trapped. If we split up, we might have a chance. Someone might find a way out." Ethan hesitated, torn between the irrationality of the suggestion and the growing desperation of their situation. "He's right," he finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We don't have any other options." Jenna shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "This is crazy. We'll get separated. We'll never find each other again." Lucas's expression was unreadable, his voice calm and detached. "That's the risk we have to take." And so, with fear gnawing at their hearts, the group made the fateful decision to split up, each of them venturing into the unknown, hoping against hope that they would find a way out before the forest claimed them completely. As they parted ways, the fog thickened, swallowing them one by one until the clearing was empty, save for the cairn that stood silently at its center. The forest, now eerily still, seemed to watch as they disappeared into the trees, the trail narrowing until it was nothing more than a memory. And the forest waited, patient and eternal, for the next group to wander too far off the beaten path. The fog rolled in thicker than before, wrapping the forest in a cold, suffocating blanket. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to every surface and deadening sound, creating an eerie silence that only served to amplify the group's isolation. The decision to split up had been made, but as they each set off in different directions, the reality of their situation began to sink in with terrifying clarity. Ethan and Claire moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The trees loomed larger now, their twisted branches interlocking overhead, forming a dark tunnel that seemed to close in tighter with every step. Ethan kept his eyes forward, trying to focus on the faint path ahead, but the unease gnawing at his gut refused to be silenced. "This place," Claire whispered, breaking the oppressive silence. "It feels like it's alive, like it's watching us." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but her words echoed the fear that had been growing within him since they first noticed the carvings. He tightened his grip on the map, now a useless scrap of paper, and forced himself to keep moving. "We just need to keep our heads," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll find a way out." But the further they walked, the more the forest seemed to twist and warp around them. The trees, already dense, seemed to shift position, their trunks moving subtly as if trying to block their path. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Claire suddenly stopped, her breath hitching as she pointed to something just ahead. Ethan followed her gaze and saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to be real, but they both saw it. His heart pounded in his chest, and he instinctively stepped in front of Claire, his protective instincts kicking in. "What was that?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, her fear palpable. Ethan strained his eyes, trying to see through the fog, but whatever it was had vanished. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice tight, "but we need to keep moving. Stay close." They continued on, their pace quickening despite the narrowing path. The forest seemed to close in even more, the trees now so close together that they had to weave through them like a maze. The carvings on the trees became more frequent, their patterns more intricate and disturbing. Some depicted figures, humanoid shapes twisted in agony, their faces frozen in silent screams. Claire shuddered as she passed one such carving, her hand reaching out to touch it. "These weren't here before," she said, her voice trembling. "They're changing, growing." Ethan pulled her hand back. "Don't touch them," he warned. "We don't know what they mean." But even as he said it, he couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. The carvings seemed almost sentient, as if they were watching, waiting for something. He forced himself to look away and pushed onward, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't suppress. They had been walking for what felt like hours, the sense of time slipping away as the forest tightened its grip. The fog thickened, becoming almost a tangible wall around them, and Ethan could feel the panic rising in his chest. He had always prided himself on being level-headed, but this was something beyond his understanding. Suddenly, Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan turned sharply to see what had startled her. Ahead of them, partially obscured by the fog, was a small, dilapidated campsite. The remnants of a tent, now just a tattered piece of canvas, lay collapsed on the ground. Scattered around it were the remnants of a fire pit, long cold, and a few rusted cans that had been left behind. "What is this?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan approached the campsite cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground for any signs of recent activity. But it was clear that this site had been abandoned for years, if not decades. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves and debris. "I don't know," Ethan replied, kneeling beside the fire pit. "But whoever was here, they've been gone a long time." Claire knelt beside him, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity. As she sifted through the debris, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. She pulled it out of the leaves, a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and cracked with age. She opened it slowly, the pages brittle and yellowed. "Look at this," she said, holding it out to Ethan. "It's a journal, or a diary." Ethan took the notebook from her, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat but faded, the ink barely legible in some places. He scanned the entries, his heart sinking as he realized what he was reading. The entries detailed a group of hikers, much like their own, who had ventured into the forest following the same trail. "They were here," Ethan muttered, his voice hollow. "Just like us. They saw the carvings, the fog, everything." Claire's eyes widened as she read over his shoulder. "But that was years ago. How?" "They didn't make it out," Ethan said, his voice cracking as the weight of the situation bore down on him. The last entry was hastily scrawled, the words nearly illegible. "We're trapped. The forest won't let us go. We're not alone." Before they could process the implications, a rustling sound came from the trees behind them. Ethan shot to his feet, his heart racing. "We need to go," he said, grabbing Claire's arm. "Now!" They turned to leave, but the forest had closed in around them even more. The trail they had followed was gone, replaced by a wall of trees and fog. Panic set in as they realized they were completely surrounded. "Ethan, we're trapped!" Claire's voice was high-pitched, on the verge of hysteria. Ethan scanned the trees, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But as he searched, he saw movement again, this time closer, the shadowy figure darting between the trees, barely visible in the thickening fog. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. But the silence it left behind was even more terrifying. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Suddenly, Claire's grip tightened on his arm. "Ethan, where's Lucas?" Ethan's blood ran cold. He spun around, searching the fog for any sign of their quiet companion. But Lucas was gone. There was no trace of him, no sound, no movement, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into the trees. "Lucas!" Ethan called out, his voice cracking with fear. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Claire was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "He was right behind us, Ethan. He was right there." Ethan didn't have an answer. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He had known Lucas for years, trusted him, but now he was gone, swallowed by the forest without a trace. "We have to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice trembling despite his attempt to stay calm. "We have to find the others." But even as he said it, he knew it was futile. The forest had them in its grip, and there was no escape. As they pushed forward, the fog seemed to close in even more, and the forest became a maze of twisted trees and shifting shadows. They walked for what felt like hours, the silence around them broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. The fog was so thick now that they could barely see a few feet in front of them, and then, without warning, Claire stumbled and fell to the ground with a sharp cry. Ethan was at her side in an instant, helping her to her feet. "Are you okay?" Claire nodded, though her face was pale and her hands were trembling. "I'm fine, I tripped on something." Ethan looked down and saw what had caused her to fall. Half buried in the dirt was another carving, this one larger and more elaborate than the others. It depicted a figure, human but distorted, its limbs twisted and its face contorted in a grotesque expression of pain. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This carving was different from the others. It felt personal, like it was meant for them. "We need to go," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned to leave, a sound broke the silence. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all around them. It was deep and guttural, like the sound of something massive and ancient stirring in the depths of the forest. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. He had heard that sound before, in his nightmares. It was the sound of something that should not exist, something that defied the laws of nature. Claire clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Ethan, what is that?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. The fog swirled around them, thickening into a wall of white that obscured everything beyond a few feet. And then, out of the fog, a figure emerged. It was Lucas, but not the Lucas they knew. His eyes were vacant, his face twisted into an expression of pure terror. He stumbled toward them, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Lucas!" Claire cried out, rushing toward him. But Ethan held her back, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, terribly wrong. As Lucas drew closer, they saw the truth. His clothes were torn and dirty, his skin pale and waxy. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, Lucas opened his mouth. but no words came out. Only a low, guttural moan that sent chills down their spines. Claire gasped, stumbling back. Oh my God, what happened to him? But Ethan knew. Lucas wasn't alive, not in the way they were. The forest had taken him, twisted him into something else, and now it was coming for them. Without another word, Ethan grabbed Claire's hand and ran, pulling her away from the horror that had once been their friend. They plunged into the fog, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they fled deeper into the forest. But no matter how fast they ran, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees shifting and moving to block their path. The fog was everywhere, suffocating and disorienting, turning every direction into an endless maze of white. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the chase ended. Ethan and Claire burst into another clearing, their chests heaving as they struggled to catch their breath. But this clearing was different from the others. It was filled with the remnants of another campsite, this one older and more decayed than the last. In the center of the clearing was another cairn, larger and more ominous than the one they had seen before. And at its base, partially covered by leaves and debris, was another notebook, its pages filled with the same desperate scrawl as the one they had found earlier. Ethan picked it up with trembling hands, flipping through the pages. The entries were fragmented, written in a shaky hand that betrayed the author's fear. They spoke of the forest's relentless pursuit, of something that hunted them, something that could not be seen but was always there. And then, in the final entry, a chilling revelation. We are not the first. We are not the last. The forest is a prison, and we are its prisoners. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him as the weight of those words sank in. They were trapped in a place that existed outside of time, outside of reality, and there was no escape. Claire's voice broke through his thoughts, trembling with fear. Ethan, what do we do now? Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with despair. He didn't have an answer. They were lost in a forest that defied logic, where time had no meaning, and where the trees themselves seemed to be alive. And as they stood there, the fog swirling around them, the growl returned, low and menacing, like the sound of something ancient and hungry. Ethan took a step back, his grip tightening on Claire's hand. We keep moving, he said, though his voice betrayed the hopelessness he felt. We have to keep moving, but deep down he knew the truth. The forest had taken Lucas, and it would take them too. It was only a matter of time. As they left the clearing, the fog thickened once more, and the trees closed in around them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The growl followed them, growing louder with each step, a constant reminder that they were being hunted. And one by one, the group was disappearing, swallowed by the forest's relentless hunger, leaving only echoes of their fear and despair behind. The forest was alive, and it was hungry, and it would not stop until it had consumed them all. Claire stumbled forward, her legs trembling beneath her, every breath a struggle against the choking fog that had become her world. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by the pounding of her heart and the distant echoes of those terrible, guttural growls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The forest, once merely ominous, had become a living nightmare, a labyrinth from which there was no escape. She was alone now. Ethan had vanished without a trace, just like the others. One moment he had been beside her, their hands tightly clasped as they fought to keep moving forward. And the next, he was gone, swallowed by the mist, his last words lost to the wind. The realization had hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping and disoriented. But she hadn't stopped running. She couldn't stop. To stop was to be consumed by the forest, to become another of its twisted creations, another lost soul in its endless depths. But now, as she stood at the edge of yet another clearing, her legs finally gave out. She collapsed to the ground, the cold, damp earth pressing against her palms, the weight of her exhaustion and terror crushing down on her. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but she knew there would be no answer. There was no one left to hear her. The forest had taken them all. In the center of the clearing stood something that sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through her. It was the same cairn she had seen before, the same pile of stones topped with that same cursed carving. But how? How could it be here again? She had fled, run as fast as her legs could carry her, desperate to escape this place. But the forest had brought her back to where it all began. A dry, hollow laugh escaped her lips, the sound alien to her ears in the stillness of the night. It was the laugh of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of fear, beyond hope, to the very edge of sanity. There was no escape. The forest had toyed with them, led them in circles, and now it had brought her back to the beginning, back to where this nightmare had started. With trembling hands, Claire reached out and touched the stones, their cold surface rough against her fingertips. It was as if they were alive, humming with an energy she could feel vibrating through her bones. And then, beneath the stones, she saw it, a glimmer of something familiar, something she knew all too well. With a sickening sense of inevitability, she pulled it free. The notebook, the same battered, leather-bound journal she had found earlier, now back in her hands as if it had never left. The pages were tattered and yellowed with age, the ink smudged and faded, but the words were still there, haunting in their familiarity. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the frantic scrawl of the last entry. We are not the first. We are not the last. The forest is a prison, and we are its prisoners. Her breath hitched in her throat, the words blurring before her eyes as the weight of their meaning crushed her. She was trapped, just like the others before her. The forest was a prison, and she had been lured into it, just as they had. And now, like them, she would become part of the forest's twisted tale, her story just another chapter in an endless cycle of horror. But as she turned the pages, something new caught her eye, something that hadn't been there before. In the final pages of the notebook, the writing had changed. The frantic scrawl had given way to something more deliberate, more controlled. The handwriting was hers. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the words she had no memory of writing. The ink was fresh, the lines of each letter sharp and clear, as though they had been written only moments ago. But how? How could this be? She didn't understand, but deep down she knew. The forest was playing with her, forcing her to confront the truth she had been trying to deny. The words on the page were a record of her own journey, of the decisions she had made, the fear she had felt, and the desperate hope that had kept her moving forward, even as the world around her crumbled into chaos. It was all there, every detail, every thought, laid bare in black ink on the yellowed pages. And then, at the very end of the notebook, the final entry, a single sentence written in her own hand. The cycle begins again. Claire's hands shook as she stared at the words, her mind reeling with the implications. This was it. This was the end of the story, the end of her story. But it wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, the beginning of the same nightmare that had consumed those before her and would consume those who came after. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed them, and now she would be the one to leave the marks, to guide the next group into its clutches. She dropped the notebook, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't want to believe it, but the truth was undeniable. The forest was a trap, a never-ending cycle of terror, and she was its latest victim. But she was also its next predator. The fog thickened around her, closing in like a shroud, and the forest seemed to sigh, a low, ominous sound that reverberated through the trees. The growls that had once filled her with dread now felt distant, almost comforting in their familiarity. The fear that had gripped her heart loosened, replaced by a cold, numb acceptance. She was no longer Claire, the frightened hiker lost in the woods. She was something else now, something eternal, something that would live on in the carvings and the fog, in the whispers of the trees. Slowly she stood, her movements no longer frantic but deliberate, calm. She looked around the clearing, her eyes lingering on the trees that had once seemed so menacing. Now they felt like old friends watching her with a knowing gaze. She understood now. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a being, ancient and powerful, feeding on the fear and despair of those who wandered too far from the safety of the known world. And she was a part of it. With steady hands, Claire reached down and picked up a sharp stone from the ground. The forest watched, silent and expectant, as she walked to the nearest tree, her breath calm and even. She raised the stone and began to carve, her movements smooth and practiced, as if she had done this many times before. The symbol took shape under her hand, intricate and perfect, a mark that would guide the next group into the forest's embrace. As she worked, the fog began to lift, the oppressive weight of it easing as the trees around her opened up, revealing a narrow path that led away from the clearing. But Claire didn't need to follow it. She knew where it led. It was the same path that had brought her here, the same path that would bring others. When she finished, she stepped back, admiring her work. The symbol glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing with the energy of the forest. It was a beacon, a signpost for the lost, a promise of adventure that would lure them in, just as it had lured her. Claire turned away from the tree, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. She knew what she had to do now. She would walk the trail again, but this time she wouldn't be a victim. She would be the guide, the one who left the marks, the one who watched as the next group made their way into the heart of the forest. And when they arrived, when they realized they were trapped, she would be there, waiting, a part of the forest, a part of the cycle that never ended. The fog lifted completely, revealing the trailhead in the distance, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches reaching toward the sky as if in silent prayer. The forest was at peace, content in the knowledge that the cycle would continue, that it would always have its prey. Claire took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and began to walk. The path was familiar now, the twists and turns no longer confusing, but comforting. She didn't look back as she left the clearing, her steps steady and sure. As she walked, the forest seemed to come alive around her, the trees whispering in a language she now understood. She was home, and she would wait for the next group, knowing that the cycle would repeat, that it would never end. And when they arrived, she would be there, the silent guide, the watcher in the woods, leading them into the darkness. The forest sighed, a contented sound that echoed through the trees, and the cycle began again,